Chapter 5: The Ecosystem of Cosmic Intelligence. If the locus represent different fields within the architecture of existence, then the next question is how such an immense system could function as a coherent whole. A universe containing countless beings, realms, forces, processes, and levels of consciousness would require more than isolated structures. It would require relationship. Everything would need to interact with everything else according to some underlying order. This chapter explores that possibility, that reality is not a collection of disconnected events, but an interconnected ecosystem of intelligence in which constructive and restrictive forces work together to maintain the conditions through which consciousness develops. Reality as an interconnected system. We tend to experience reality as a collection of separate things: individual people, separate events, independent causes, one moment followed by another. But beneath this surface separation is an extraordinary degree of interdependence. A human being exists through countless relationships between body, environment, memory, food, breath, relationships, culture, planetary conditions, and countless other processes. Remove enough of those relationships, and the individual cannot exist independently. The same principle can be extended to the cosmos. A realm does not exist in isolation from the consciousness inhabiting it. Consciousness does not develop independently of experience. Experience does not occur independently of circumstance. Circumstance does not exist independently of the wider structures of reality. Everything participates in everything else. Within the framework of this book, this interconnectedness is not merely mechanical. It can be understood as an ecosystem of cosmic intelligence. Intelligence does not necessarily mean that every process involves a human-like mind making decisions. It can also refer to the ordering principle through which different parts of reality interact in coherent ways. The universe does not need to think like a person to possess order. The order itself may be the intelligence. Constructive and restrictive forces. Within any functioning ecosystem, forces operate in different directions. Some processes build, others break down, some expand, others contain, some accelerate, others restrain. None of these functions are automatically good or evil. Growth requires expansion, but it also requires boundaries. A cell must maintain its membrane. A living organism must regulate what enters and leaves. A river flows because its banks constrain its movement. A seed develops because its structure directs its growth. Restriction, therefore, is not necessarily opposed to development. Sometimes restriction is precisely what allows development to occur. The same principle can be applied to consciousness. There may be forces within existence that expand awareness and forces that limit, stabilize, or contain it. From the perspective of the individual consciousness, a restrictive force may feel unpleasant, but its subjective unpleasantness does not necessarily tell us its ultimate function. A boundary can frustrate movement while simultaneously preserving the integrity of the system. This is one of the reasons the prison planet interpretation can be so compelling. We experience restriction directly. We do not always perceive its function, so we interpret the restriction as opposition. The curriculum model asks us to consider whether restriction might sometimes be protective, developmental, or regulatory, rather than hostile. Why order requires boundaries. Without boundaries, there can be no stable system. Imagine a world without physical laws. Matter could behave unpredictably. Cause and effect would collapse. Biological processes could not maintain coherence. Experience would become impossible to organize. The very possibility of learning depends upon some degree of consistency. If the same action produced completely different consequences every time, experience would provide little usable information. Curriculum requires rules, not because rules are inherently restrictive, but because consistency creates learning. The student learns that certain actions produce certain outcomes. The body learns that certain conditions produce certain responses. The mind learns that certain patterns lead to certain consequences. Consciousness learns through correspondence. This is why lawfulness is so important to the framework of this book. A lawful reality does not need to be morally punitive. It simply needs to be consistent. The difference between law and control. This distinction becomes especially important when discussing cosmic administration. To say that reality contains governing principles is not necessarily to say that consciousness is being oppressed. There is a difference between control imposed for domination and regulation required for coherence. The human body itself contains regulatory systems operating continuously beyond conscious control. The heart beats, the immune system responds, hormones fluctuate, cells repair themselves. The individual does not consciously administer every process required to remain alive. Yet these processes are not necessarily enemies of the individual. They are part of the system that allows the individual to exist. Likewise, within the cosmological model explored here, administration does not automatically imply imprisonment. It may represent the regulatory intelligence required to maintain the relationship between different levels of reality. This provides a broader interpretation of the archonic principle. Rather than imagining archons as entities whose primary purpose is to prevent liberation, they can be understood as administrators within a larger network of lawful order. Karmic administration. Within the greater whole, this is where karma becomes particularly important. If consciousness develops through experience, then experiences must correspond to the state of consciousness encountering them. Otherwise, the curriculum would have no coherence. Karmic administration, in this framework, is the mechanism through which that correspondence is maintained. It is not a cosmic courtroom. There is no need for an external judge deciding who deserves pleasure and who deserves pain. Instead, karma can be understood as a network of lawful relationships between consciousness, action, tendency, circumstance, and consequence. What consciousness carries influences what it encounters. What it encounters influences what it learns. What it learns changes what it is capable of carrying, and the cycle continues. This creates an extraordinarily precise feedback system. A particular attachment generates particular patterns. Those patterns generate particular experiences. Those experiences expose the attachment. Understanding weakens the attachment. The pattern changes. The curriculum changes with it. This is karma understood as correspondence rather than punishment. The administrator does not need to judge. Once karma is understood mechanically, the role of administration becomes clearer. An administrator does not necessarily need to decide whether someone is good or bad. The system itself can produce consequences according to its structure. If consciousness carries a particular tendency, that tendency interacts with reality. If a lesson remains incomplete, circumstances may continue to reveal it. If capacity develops, the same circumstances may no longer produce the same reaction. The system, therefore, does not need to condemn consciousness. It simply reflects it. This is why karmic administration can be understood as a function of cosmic order rather than divine morality. The universe does not need to punish. It needs only to correspond. The intelligence of restriction. One of the deeper implications of this framework is that restriction itself may contain intelligence. A boundary tells consciousness where its present capacity ends. A recurring pattern shows where understanding remains incomplete. A limitation reveals what cannot yet be expressed. A delay may prevent premature movement into conditions for which consciousness is not prepared. A closed door may redirect experience toward another part of the curriculum. This does not mean that every disappointment should automatically be interpreted as a hidden cosmic instruction. The point is not to manufacture meaning where none can be established. The point is to recognize that within a lawful system, restriction can have a function beyond simple obstruction. The boundary may be doing something. Constructive and restrictive forces. Working together. Development requires both movement and resistance. If consciousness were exposed only to expansion, there would be no opportunity to consolidate what had been gained. If it encountered only restriction, there would be no opportunity to develop beyond its current state. The curriculum therefore requires both. Expansion opens possibilities. Restriction defines the conditions. Experience provides the material. Consciousness provides the capacity to interpret it. Karma provides correspondence. And administration maintains the coherence of the overall system. These functions are not necessarily competing. They can be understood as complementary aspects of one process. This is why the universe need not be divided into forces of absolute good and absolute evil. A force that restricts one movement may protect another. A force that destroys one structure may create the conditions for a new one. A force that appears obstructive from one perspective may be preservative from another. Function depends upon context, the larger ecosystem. Once these principles are combined, reality begins to resemble something far more sophisticated than a prison. It becomes an ecosystem. Different realms interact, different levels of consciousness interact, different forces regulate one another. Experiences generate consequences. Consequences generate learning. Learning changes consciousness. Changed consciousness becomes compatible with different experiences. And the cycle continues across increasingly subtle levels of existence. The individual is therefore not an isolated prisoner inside the universe. The individual is participating in the universe. This distinction changes the entire spiritual orientation. Instead of asking which force is responsible for our confinement, we can begin asking how the different forces of existence participate in development. Instead of seeing every boundary as an enemy, we can investigate its function. Instead of interpreting karma as punishment, we can examine its correspondence. Instead of imagining archons as cosmic jailers, we can consider them as one expression of the larger administrative intelligence through which reality maintains order. From cosmic conflict to cosmic ecology. The prison planet narrative is fundamentally adversarial. There is humanity, there are the jailers, there is the prison, and there is the goal of escape. The ecological model is different. There is consciousness, there is environment. There are laws, there are relationships, there are constructive forces, there are restrictive forces, there are processes of feedback, adaptation, development, and transformation. The question is no longer simply who is against me. It becomes how does this entire system function? That is a much larger question, and it prepares the ground for the next stage of the book. If reality is an interconnected system governed by lawful correspondence, then karma is not merely an abstract spiritual principle. It is one of the mechanisms through which the entire ecosystem maintains coherence. The next chapter, therefore, turns directly toward the mechanics of karmic administration and asks a fundamental question. What if karma is not keeping a cosmic scorecard, but maintaining the precise relationship between consciousness and experience?